Hello, this is Michael Welly, and this is my presentation on the environmental exposure of benzene and the development of acute myeloid leukemia, or AML. So let's discuss the significance of exposure for benzene. So first of all, benzene is a solvent. It's colorless, inflammable liquid with a sweet odor, and it is among the 20 most widely used chemicals in the United States, according to the American Cancer Society, 2016. Benzene has been a key chemical component of the manufacturing industry, and in 2013, the U.S. manufacturing sector employed 12 million workers, or about 8.8% of total U.S. employment. And the majority of that employment seems to be um, most prevalent in the upper Midwest region. So states like Kansas and Indiana have some of the highest percentages of manufacturing workers. So some of the products that are produced in the manufacturing industry that involve exposure to benzene would be things like plastics, leather, pesticides, insecticides, etc. So some other jobs that involve exposure to benzene would be jobs in the oil refining or crude oil and gasoline industry. In 2011, the U.S. oil industry supported 5.6% of the total U.S. employment. So we can already start to see that between the manufacturing industry, the oil refining or gasoline industry, there are a lot of people potentially at risk of exposure to benzene. Now, in the general public, benzene exposure can occur in contact with gasoline, motor vehicle exhaust, and specifically tobacco smoke, which I'd like to highlight. So we all know that cigarette smoking is very prevalent still in the United States. In 2015, the CDC reported that 15.1% of U.S. adults currently smoke tobacco, and it is noted that inhalation is the most common form of benzene. The skin contact can also be dangerous. So inhalation is the ultimately the worst way that one can be exposed to benzene. So now let's discuss the significance of the outcome of AML. It is the most common form of acute leukemia among adults and accounts for the largest number of annual deaths from leukemia in the U.S. The median age of diagnosis is 67 years, with 54% of patients being diagnosed at 65 years or older. Approximately 0.5% of men and women will be diagnosed with AML at some point during their life. That was according to the NIH in 2014. That's one out of every 200 people that will be diagnosed with AML, which is pretty outstanding. So looking at that graphic in the upper right corner there, AML represents 1.3 of all new cancer cases in the United States. While this may seem like a small percentage, we have to take in all of the various types of cancer that are out there, and how common some are, and how indolent some are, and then how aggressive some are. And this is a more aggressive type of cancer that is associated with a high fatality rate if left untreated. So as we see there, 2017, approximately 21,000 people will be diagnosed with AML. 10,000, but almost 11,000 patients will die from AML. So that represents approximately 1.8% of all deaths in the U.S. The 5-year survival rate, which is a measure of the rate of survival over 5 years diagnosis to that endpoint, is approximately 27%. So about 27 out of 100 people. So just a little background. I won't go into full detail on this slide, but AML essentially is when something goes wrong in a certain lineage of the cell stem cell differentiation process. So It occurs when the myeloid cell um, starts, has a mutation, it has some epigenetic factor or something that drives it to go kind of haywire. And then from there, it becomes kind of an undifferentiated and starts reproducing or proliferating at an uncontrolled amount. And typically, these cells, um, if everything goes right in a normal cell line, they become platelets and red blood cells and special white blood cells. So, patients start to exhibit a lot of unique symptoms when they have AML. So, um, just a side note on myelodysplastic syndrome there at the bottom, because we also see it in our figure here. So, um, MDS, myelodysplastic syndrome, is a condition that is very similar to AML. It sometimes precedes AML, but it doesn't always precede AML, or MDS doesn't always turn into AML. They are defined by the different number of blast cells, or those undifferentiated cancer cells. But MDS is a little more slow growing as compared to AML. But it's worthy to note because occasionally, about a third of the time, it does turn into AML. Okay, so study summary for the three um, studies that I chose for this research project. So the first one was a retrospective cohort study. Um, so going back to 1972 to 1999, um, this study was looking at Chinese industrial workers. And as you can see there from the study population, we had a large number of individuals involved in the study, which is great. A large sample size always increases our study's strength. The measure or the exposure of interest was benzene, and how they measured it was by looking at work metrics, work history, such as how long each person worked every day, what their week schedule like, how many years they worked, where they worked, and that was obtained from each factory. The outcome is the hematopoietic malignancies, which is just a broader term that includes AML. And the measurement of the outcome for this first study was factory information, hospital records, death certificates for public and factory records. To determine, who got AML and subsequently died from AML while they were working during that time and exposed to benzene. Study number two was a case control study that did all the way back to 1965, and this was for it was a Nordic study, um, similar to the third but a little different. This was focusing just on Norwegian men um, in the offshore oil industry. We also said that the oil refining industry was a source of benzene exposure. This also had a good number of individuals involved. However, for our particular uh, cancer of interest, which is AML, they only had 112 cases matched with 100 or 1,661 controls. So a smaller, match study than we'd like, but still pretty relevant and pretty powerful. So the benzene was obviously the exposure of interest. Again, some work history was used. But one specific thing that was used to measure exposure was something called a job time exposure matrix. So this is where they um, were able to kind of quantify, how much benzene that each person was exposed to based on their job title, the amount of time they worked per day, and yeah, they were able to kind of calculate or come up with an exposure duration and intensity from this little matrix here they came up with. outcome again. AML was included, and the measurement of the outcome was from the Norwegian National Population Register and Cancer Registry of Norway. The third study, case control again, looking back in time, 1961 to 2005. This also included more Nordic countries than study number two, but it also did include Norway. However, we were looking at kind of a different population in this one. Still, we were looking at exposure of benzene, but also in this study, it's key to note that the sample size was very, very big in this. Compared to study number two, we had 76,000 matched controls, and number of cases was 15,000. So way more individuals involved in this study than study number two. Our work records linked with, again, another job exposure matrix was the measurement of the exposure. Our outcome was AML. Outcome interest was AML. And the measurement of the outcome was the Nordic Occupational Cancer Study, NOCA, as its acronym says it is. And this includes census records, cancer registries, survival status from these four countries. And through my readings, these are very extensive and pretty reliable sources of information. So it's just some results, strengths, limitations, conclusions, etc. So from the first study, remember the retrospective cohort study of Chinese workers. Some of the strengths of that study were it was a large sample size. Remember that. The duration of follow-up was very long. Remember, this study was a very long time span. And also there was a small number of subjects lost to follow-up, which is always key. Some of the limitations were absence of individual exposure estimates. Exposure assessment was limited to classification as ever versus never, so we didn't have, level of benzene exposure in there. It was really just kind of a yes or no exposure status. Additionally, misclassification of diagnosis due to variability in quality of death certificates. As we were looking back in time, we didn't have all of the pathological or technological, qualities that we have today. So there could have been a little misclassification bias in there. The conclusion on the study, though, was that significantly elevated incidence of all myeloid disorders reflected excesses of AML. The 28-year follow-up of Chinese benzene exposure workers demonstrated increased risk of a broad range of myeloid and lymphoid neoplasms. So this study did support that exposure to benzene um, was associated with the development of AML. So the second study, some of the strengths of this study was there's a high quality of data, there's National Cancer Registry, prospective case control study design, case control always very good for, looking at rare diseases. The survey response rate that was used, the survey that was used was 69%, so we had a good turnout during this study as well. This study was, adjusted and controlled for exposure status, age, smoking, to the hazard ratio for benzene exposed workers. Some of the limitations were that there's a long time span involved in the study, which could introduce recall bias. Remember, it's an individual's inability to remember things from the past during these surveys or interviews. And as I noted before, there was a small number of cases. So only 112 total cases of cancer, and specifically the number of AML cases in the study was only 10, so very low. A very low number of cases that yielded, imprecise risk measurements. Conclusions were there was evidence of dose-related risk patterns according to cumulative exposure of AML. There is an increased risk of these types of cancers, so AML, among benzene exposed offshore workers compared to the unexposed. And now study number 3. Again, this was a case control study designed with a larger cohort and a long duration of follow-up. Some limitations: a small percentage of the population had exposure to study. Exposure misclassification again due to poor work history records. Uh, there was no control for smoking in this study, which remember from our previous slides, smoking is a huge factor that could contribute to benzene exposure. And they did not control for genetic factors, where I didn't think this was as important, but is notable because some studies outside of what we've looked at here have looked at the genetic implications associated with AML. So the conclusion of this study was that researchers did not observe an association between benzene exposure and AML. Okay. So here's Hedekin's criteria here. I won't go over everything too much. I'll just give you a chance to kind of look at everything. A couple things I will highlight are just kind of the statistical significance of each study. So the first study, the Chinese industrial workers, they did find statistically significant because the null was not included in the 95% confidence interval that they calculated. It still could potentially include the null, but from the confidence interval that they found, they're 95% sure that the null does not fall within that range. So um, study number 2, their p-value was just over um, 0.05, which we associate with statistical significance, so that they ultimately could not reject the null in this. But we were very close to that cutoff, so I think it could warrant further research. And then study number 3, the p-value reported was way greater than 0.05, and so they found no statistical significance um, of any benzene association with AML in this study. Some of our strengths of association. Study number 1, we looked at the relative risk, which we found was 2.7. Well, that's pretty high. The study number 2, recall, looked at cumulative benzene exposure. So they actually separated into tiers. The T1, T2, T3, those are the amounts of exposure by parts per million of benzene over the year. And as you can see, for the unexposed, our hazard ratio would be 1 because that is our reference or control group. Tier 1 group, which is the lowest dose exposure, their hazard ratio was 1.4, so higher than 1. So there is a hazard there with that. But our 95% confidence interval did include the null 1. So tier 2 was 0.85, so lower than 1, so more of a protective risk there. And then tier 3 was 4.85. So this is really what they were going off of a lot on their study, was that at high exposures, the hazard ratio was 4.85. Though the confidence interval did include the null, our hazard ratio was still very large. So we have to look at all of these statistics and kind of interpret them together. So third study, no association. There was one hazard ratio that was over 1, but it was just barely over 1, and it was actually the lowest amount of benzene parts per million per year. So, okay. So some public health implications for this review of studies. So for decades, as we had learned earlier, benzene has been involved in the manufacturing industry, oil, gasoline industry, It is a top, chemical used in the United States, and since these industries employ so many people, it even though we got mixed results on the studies we looked at, I really think that it warrants further um, research to be done, or at least some education to be put out there um, to improve working conditions and also improve our general health our, of the public. So just letting people know that smoking causes high levels of exposure to benzene, and that inhalation of it is the kind of the worst way to be exposed to benzene. So I think educating the public and just really cleaning up the way we do things in the manufacturing industries and other industries as well as general public is very important. Um, there are some screening tests that do look for benzene. There are some peripheral blood tests that can measure benzene. These types of things could be implemented for individuals that are at an increased risk of benzene exposure. This could eventually lead to better prevention strategies. As we looked at study number 2, we saw that the high level of benzene exposure gave us that hazard ratio of 4.85. So, maybe looking at someone who works, 10 hours a day in the manufacturing industry, maybe at the end of the day, or maybe during halfway through the day, looking at what's their level of benzene in their blood, and saying, okay, you've had enough today, time to go home, and really limiting benzene exposure, in order to prevent what could become AML or something else. So again, while the data was inconsistent across the 3 studies that we analyzed, there was some compelling evidence to suggest, as I said, educating the public and implementing more regulations and limit exposure. Obviously, this warrants more research, but I think that implementing, some kind of a passive um, actions in the public and in the working environment would ultimately be beneficial for everyone. And then here are references. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. It's mwelly at kumc.edu, mwelle at kumc.edu. And thank you very much. Goodbye.